Hello. Previously I did a video on removing a Rotor RS4X crankset. In this video I'm going to show how to take one apart and do some maintenance on it and then put it back together. Now, one of the things I wanted to say was that this particular crankset has 8 bearings in it. It's got 3 cartridge bearings and 5 needle bearings. Got a cartridge bearing behind this bolt, which is a double row bearing. Got a cartridge bearing right here for the right bottom or the left bottom bracket cup. And then you got a large cartridge bearing between the spider and the eccentric. The needle bearings, you have one inside here, and then the other 4 are in these little black pivot links here. Now, if you followed the previous video, you should end up with what I've got in my hand right here. I'm going to take out the little 6mm bolt here. That's for adjusting the regulation point. But anyways, the first thing you're going to do is remove the bolt, the left spindle bolt. And the little installation tool behind it, which is this tube. Next thing you're going to do is remove this spacer. Set it down, and you're going to remove the bearing. Then you're going to hold the whole assembly in your hand. You're going to rotate it around so the 6mm bolt hole is in the vicinity of the regulation marks. And then just hold it just like that. A little tap on the spindle. The whole thing pops apart. Okay. You have O-rings in there and they're going to come out. We're going to take these O-rings and set them aside. They're to seal the bearings. So here's what you got at this point. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take these pivot links off. The O-rings will be right there. There's the other one. This O-ring stayed on. This is where they go. Okay, now here's what you do. You grease this needle bearing right here. It's got a little rubber seal there. You just put a little grease in there. I usually cut the end off of a Q-tip and swish it around in there a little bit. Get some grease in there. Put a little grease on these pivot links here. You might want to put a little dab of grease in each side of these cups. And that's all there is to greasing the crankset. The cartridge bearings you don't have to deal with. They're sealed. Don't require regular maintenance. Anytime you deal with them, you're probably replacing them, but that's a video for another time. So to assemble this back together properly, take your O-rings, set them in place. There's a little groove there that they fit in. Okay, and here's another thing. These pivot links, you want the end with the emblem on it, that little white emblem there. You want that on this part, on the spider. So after you've greased these, Don't put too much grease in there, because then a lot of times you go to push them on and the pressure will want to push it back off. So just put the O-ring in position, stick that back on there. Take the next one, and this one goes the opposite way. Okay, so you've got that part done. Okay, now you're going to take the O-rings and put them right here on the pivot links. Okay, they're in place. Okay, now here's the part that can be a little tricky. We're going to set this down for a minute. It's tricky sometimes because this can move, but the object here is to put these pins into the holes of these pivot links while putting the spindle down the center bearing here. So what I try to do is hold this with my fingers, put that in there like that, and kind of hold it with the bottom of my hand a little bit. And you can move them around, try and get them lined up. There we go. Once you got them lined up, you just wiggle it a little bit with your fingers, and it's in. Now, one of the things I didn't mention is that there's a tube in here. In that tube, you want to make sure you don't have to remove it if you don't want to. It's no big deal, but that tube is there for a reason. The center race of this bearing is against that tube, so you got the outer tube here pushing against the outer race of the bearing, and the inner tube that I just pulled out pushing against the inner race. That way when you tighten things up, the bearing doesn't bind. If you got that, if there is no center tube there and you start tightening things up, it's going to try and push the center race of the bearing into here, and it's going to bind the bearing. So that center tube is important. But now you got the bearing back on, put the sleeve back on, the spacer. Installation tube. Put the spindle bolt back in. And it's all back together. Now, sometimes if you have a problem where you haven't installed the crankset correctly and everything isn't in all the way here, what you can do is loosen up your bottom bracket cup and then just come over to this side and kind of wiggle it a little bit till it goes in, and then tighten the bottom bracket cup back in. If you don't do that and just start tightening this, things will bind over here and it won't go in. So now you're ready to install the crank. All you do to install the crank is put your 6mm bolt back in. Now you just put the bottom bracket into your frame and just start turning counterclockwise. Make sure you don't cross the threads, and it'll screw right into your frame. You put it in the frame far enough to where This large sprocket is centered in the front derailleur when it's in the outermost position. So you center that in there, and then you put the left cup in, snug it down just a little bit, enough to where you can still turn this and see the bolt move, because you're going to need that to move to set your regulation point. And that's all there is to it, really. When you set the regulation point, you just have the person set on the bike with their pedals, their normal pedals they use, and their bike shoes. You push the crank arm straight out, and you adjust the position of this bolt here. There's some alignment points in there. I usually do it with the arrow right next to the bolt, pointed at the smallest line, the smallest regulation point over there. Once you get that lined up there, and you have the rider holding the pedal in a straight out position, and have them 2 points lined up where you want it, then you crank down the left bottom bracket cup, and then remove the bolt, and then have the rider push the crank out as far as you can. Again, double check the regulation point to see that it's where you want it. Then all you have to do is remove the left crank bolt, remove the installation tool, and then put the crank arm on instead of the installation tool. Put the bolt back in. And install your chain. Take that bolt back out. So there it is. Should be ready to ride. Thanks for watching.